Hey guys, this is Bales. I am at FantasyLabs looking at our NBA models for the night, and I wanted to create a video to just talk about some of the differences between NFL and NBA in terms of DFS. For a lot of you who might just have played NFL in the past and haven't participated in NBA or just starting because you get NBA with your FantasyLabs subscription. And I think most of the differences between the two sports boil down to sample sizes and how that affects volatility and consistency from night to night. So NBA is the most consistent sport and the most predictable sport on a night to night basis. And that really has a pretty profound effect on how we need to approach the game from a daily fantasy perspective. So we know, for example, that Stephen Curry isn't going to have 2 points, 2 fantasy points in a night unless he gets hurt, whereas Calvin Johnson or Julio Jones could realistically have one catch or two catches in a game. There's just more volatility. Football is a super event-based sport, whereas basketball is not. If a player does everything right on a particular possession, he might get 3 fantasy points, for example. So um, the way that consistency affects the game is we need to be place more trust in the projections. There's a way more narrow range of outcomes that each player can have than in a sport like football. And so that really means, as we're looking at players and looking at the values on FantasyLabs, that we probably don't want to stray too far down in terms of if you've created a good model or you're using Justin Fan's model, we really don't want to jump down too far in terms of value, because there's a good chance that, unlike in football where we could be wrong about the projections, there's a good chance that Stephen Curry, for example, we have rated in this particular model as the second best point guard tonight. It's highly unlikely that Jose Calderon is a better value tonight than Stephen Curry is, or whoever it may be. So for cash games, we're obviously sticking toward the top of the values and models. So when we optimize a lineup, we really probably want to get closer to this true optimal lineup. It doesn't mean we need to use an optimal lineup in every case, a lineup that optimizes points, but we want to probably stick closer to that lineup than we might in another sport. In tournaments, typically in other sports, especially football and baseball, we don't have to stick with the top values that we might want to use in cash games. In basketball, because of that consistency, it's harder to fade guys who are obvious values. So I typically suggest that you don't fade those guys and try to be contrarian at positions that maybe are a little bit closer in terms of value. So at forward for tonight, for example, and this is only a 4-game slate, so this is a good example. At strong forward, we have Carmelo Anthony in this model 14 points higher than Rudy Gay. Probably an obvious value. He might have high ownership, but because of that predictability, the narrow range of outcomes, the price, you probably do want to have Anthony in your lineup, and you can see he's in the optimal, whereas we might try to be a little bit more contrarian at power forward, for example, where we have Bobby Portis as the top value, DeMarcus Cousins right behind, Paul Millsap right behind him, Dirk not far behind. So probably we're going to see lower ownership on the top owned guy at that position. Potentially a spot to be a little bit contrarian in tournaments, but again, probably want to stick to the top of the values. Because of that consistency, it means that we typically want to emphasize the projections more and any stat that has to do with price sensitivity. Basketball is a super price sensitive sport because of that predictability. So things like bargain rating are very predictive. If we go to the optimizer, we obviously are going to rate Justin does the best projections, in my opinion, in daily fantasy. His projections, which you can edit, by double clicking and editing. It'll re-rate any player within your model. We want to rate those pretty highly. Things like monthly salary change, again, related to price, probably want to rate higher in our models than we might in NFL, for example. Another thing to look at that really dictates a lot of the value in these projections that Justin's creating are his minutes and really the usage projections. If you strongly disagree with how we are projecting players in terms of minutes and usage, you can edit that and edit the projections. But that's really, really a big time predictor of fantasy value, is how many possessions a player is really going to be involved in. And then the final thing that I'll say is news is extremely important in NBA. In baseball or even in football, you can win a tournament, even a large tournament, with a 0 or one player underperforming. In basketball, you really can't do that. If you have one guy who underperforms in a big way, you're just not going to be able to win. You need to stay on top of news. And news doesn't come out in the same way as in other sports where we have lineup cards for MLB usually a few hours before first pitch. In football, 90 minutes before kickoff, we have injury reports. NBA, it might be 5 minutes before the game, a guy gets scratched. And because of how time on the court, minutes, and usage are so correlated to fantasy production, when those guys step into the starting lineup and are going to see a boost in minutes, when someone is benched at the last second and his min-priced backup is coming in and is going to see 3 times his normal minutes, he just becomes an auto start, basically. And it's really valuable to stay on top of that news. And that's probably the biggest advantage that we offer at FantasyLabs with our NBA product is the news. So you can click on Player News, which is free. We have updates coming out all the time with analysis. Our Twitter account, FantasyLabs NBA, has basically everything you need. We really are the first ones to get out news after beat reporters, and staying on top of that news because of the consistency and predictability of the sport is so vital, because you really can't afford to miss on anyone, and you can't miss those obvious values. So those are some of the ways that I think NBA differs from NFL. There's a lot of similarities too. The same general approach that you take to daily fantasy in terms of trying to evolve and improve and use data to make good decisions, game theory and tournaments, that all applies. But the implementation might be a little bit different. So hopefully this is helpful, and definitely if you haven't already, check out our NBA product.